My name is Ricky Teja-Paibel. I'm a dual degree student at the Heinz College School of Public Policy and Management and at the Tepper School of Business. My question is, if there is a make or break milestone that has to be resolved at this G20 meeting to prevent the world economy from suffering a lot further, what would that milestone be?
Okay. Everybody has one for this one.
I don't know. My bet is there'll be some support for, continuing to prevent a trade war with tariffs. I mean, that's the thing. You know, in boxing, we have punches. You punch to the body, and after 12 rounds, you'll weaken your opponent. On the other hand, if you punch at the head, you might knock him out. The knockout potential for the G20 would be a collapse of trade harmonies so as to produce a cascading of retaliatory tariff increases. That would be a knockout blow to the economy that would put us in the Great Depression, and I think that's got to be job one at this point, especially given what the news is saying in the last few days. I know that Lee is a little more optimistic than I am. Maybe I'm too pessimistic about that.
Gabriel?
Hard to say. As I said, I'm sure that we will not relieve this crisis. We will have other ones. There should be some discussion while remaining completely independent as far as fiscal policy goes. It seems that we've survived this downturn, but it was after great expenses were made. And we're still not out of the woods, and we have to be very, very careful that once the initial stimulus or stimuli are finished, the economies do not relapse. And I would hope to see some coordination in that regard. But no independence should be relinquished by any of the countries, but they'll all be better off, or we'll be all better off if they talk to each other about how to proceed. As is the case with fiscal policy or with trade policy, there's always the incentive to say, well, let the other guy do it. If everybody else does it and I don't, we'll be okay. And certainly this is what we should try to avoid.
I would go back to what I said, which is I really do believe that they have to deal with recapitalizing the regional banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and to a less extent the Asian Development Bank. You know, more than 1 billion people could be hurt if they don't address that issue. It's a looming crisis, but it's not going to fundamentally collapse the system, but it certainly will collapse, poor people, at the household level.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to view the G20 summit as being part of this series of G20 meetings, some of which involve heads of state, like the meeting in Pittsburgh, others of which involve only finance ministers and central bankers. If you follow the paper trail that has been generated by these meetings over the last year or so, what you see is an emerging consensus on the broad directions in which governments seem to think the world needs to move, but not a lot of specifics, not a lot of ironclad commitments. There have been some recapitalization of the IMF, right, which I guess they're still collecting the checks for. But not a lot of discussion on the specifics. But, if that's all that happens in Pittsburgh, I, for one, am not going to be too disappointed, because the simple fact that we've got this larger group meeting together on a regular basis, sharing ideas, forced to confront one another's views, I think that's a healthy development for the global economy and for the global system. And if there is a silver lining in this crisis, it may be that it has helped institutionalize a broader, more inclusive approach to global economic governance. And that can't fail to be a good thing.
Good. Sir.
Hello, my name is Anthony Sermonaro. I'm a member of the general public, local attorney here. Not sure if my question isn't the same as the one that was just asked. I'll take a chance and think that it isn't. For each of the panelists, I was just wondering if you had your wish list of one thing that would happen at this summit in Pittsburgh, that is one kind of a communique or an agreement, or however, I assume that one of the results of the summit will be that there'll be some kind of a communication or a summary of it. What would be that one thing that each of you would look for to make this a successful summit? And if that's the same question as was just asked, I also have an idea that a lot of the solutions and the progress seems to be based on an idea that growth is what's important. That if we don't have growth in our economies, that there's something wrong. Are there any out-of-the-box solution, out-of-the-box thinking that can be done here that's kind of radically different than anything that's been thought before that you might, if you had your wish list, suggest?
A wish list. Who wants to start?
I think one is there are things that one would wish for, and then things that one would wish for that are actually have a slight chance of actually taking place. So I can think of many wonderful things that I could ask, but they're not feasible. I'd settle for additional, as I mentioned, additional comments on how they would coordinate in case there were a relapse. They were actually fairly coordinated in terms, at least the central banks were, in terms of providing swap lines, credit lines, and governments providing support. I'd welcome that. And certainly what was mentioned earlier about trade, I think would be a welcome development. There are other things as one would wish for, but they're just not going to happen.
Well, I'm going to be a little controversial. I'm a former central banker at the Federal Reserve, and one of the things that makes me nervous about the G20 is all these central banks are participating in a prior meeting, and we're all talking about coordination. Well, it so happens that one of the reasons we have independent central banks around the world is so that we can have independent monetary policy, and we have a flexible exchange rate. And since no one's saying this, I'll be a champion of flexibility in the exchange rate and independent central banking and go against the grain of the G20. I'm happy with the G20 coordinating on things other than monetary policy because we have independent central banks. And here's why I'm worried, that if central banks get put under the thumb of their respective governments in this overarching umbrella of world coordination, we could have a roaring inflation. The reason we have independent central banks is to prevent inflation in our own countries. That is to prevent our governments from pushing the central banks to print money to get out of fiscal policy jams. I'm a little uncomfortable as a former central banker fighting for independence of the Federal Reserve within the U.S., giving it up under the umbrella of G20. So there I'll be. That's my wish, is we don't coordinate monetary policy.
Okay. Very good. Okay.
I guess I would, it's not going to happen, but I would, I would change the participant list quite a lot. I think it's, when we talk about sort of the major economies, it's a little bit of an artificial bringing together. The U.S. economy as a percent of the world GDP is 23%. The next one is Japan at 8%. There's a huge gap between that. And then as you go on down the line, you're getting to 1.69. Cobble a bunch of them together and you'll get 90%, right? But you're cobbling, so you could cobble some others. So I think that there's a little bit of a falseness in the list. And I will say again, I really do think that it would be good that the Europeans are overrepresented. And it may be some type of structure that looks at the major economies in each region, no matter their size vis-a-vis the global, could bring about greater representation, inclusion, and create that real discussion that would lead to a reshaping of the institutions, the international institutions. For instance, there's no reason why Nigeria should not be invited, from my perspective, to this meeting when Sweden and the Netherlands and Spain are, in terms of Nigeria's importance to sub-Saharan Africa versus their importance to their region.